The first thing to give up wasn't the bride, it was the cake. 3 tiers of pure hope, with blackberry jam Josie Whitlock had whipped by hand between the layers. It stood on a side table in that tiny clapboard church just outside of Corvallis, Montana, and it was sweating. The late June sun beat down through the windows, and the icing started to sag. The little sugared lilacs on top, they leaned over like they were tired of waiting too. The whole thing smelled sweet and sad, like a promise going soft in the heat. But Josie, she just stood at the altar. She wasn't fidgeting. Her hands were clasped steady in front of her, over the blue cotton dress she'd sewn herself. She'd pricked her thumbs raw, making it perfect. The real lilacs woven into her braid were starting to crinkle and dry, but Josie didn't seem to notice. Her little sister Maddie kept whipping her head around, staring at the open church doors like she could force a man on horseback to just appear out of thin air. A couple pews back, you could hear Miss Ada Bell whispering to anyone who'd listen. "Rail, man," she hissed behind a gloved hand. "Never trust a man who makes his promises with a timetable." But Josie didn't say a word. She didn't scan the dusty road. She didn't bite her lip. She just stared straight ahead, past the preacher, past the crooked wooden cross, out the window to the far-off hills shimmering under the sun. The man was late. Not just a little late. This was the wrong kind of late. The kind of late that feels like a bell tolling in your chest. Harlan Avery Deeks. He worked for the Northern Pacific, charting the trains. He'd promised her he'd be there sharp at noon. He was a man of schedules, of precision. He'd kissed her hand at the spring social and told her she was stronger and finer than any town girl he'd ever met. And Josie, who'd cooked and cleaned for half the valley, who'd buried her own mother and nursed her sister through fever. She had allowed herself just this once to believe him. She had allowed herself to believe she was chosen. Now the church was thick with the sound of shuffling feet and rising whispers. The preacher cleared his throat, for what must have been the third time. "Miss Whitlock," he started, "I don't mean to rush things." "You're not," she said, and her voice was so soft, but it didn't tremble, not even a little. Outside, the wind kicked up. A horse whinnied. The minutes ticked by, thick and slow like molasses. You could feel the hope draining out of the room, leaving nothing but pity behind. And then, the church doors creaked open. A wave of relief, of sound, washed through the pews. But it died just as fast, because the man standing there, silhouetted against the bright afternoon, it wasn't Harlan Deeks. This man wasn't dressed for a wedding. He wore trail-worn canvas, a shirt dark with sweat, and his boots had no shine on them at all. He held a wide-brimmed hat in his calloused hands. He looked like the kind of man who built fences and broke horses, who didn't have much use for timetables or fancy words. He stood there for a moment, letting his eyes adjust to the dim light, and then his gaze swept past the preacher, past the pews, and landed right on Josie, just her. And for a heartbeat, something passed between them. Not recognition, something else, something heavier. His voice was low and rough when he finally spoke, and it cut right through the whispers. "I apologize for the interruption." He took a step inside, the floorboards groaning under his weight. "But I heard there was a bride left standing alone." He paused, his eyes still locked on hers. "And I reckon I couldn't let that go unchallenged." A gasp went through the room. The preacher's eyebrows shot up into his hairline. This stranger walked down the aisle, his steps slow and deliberate, until he was standing just a few feet from the altar. "My name is Wade Coulter," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of that silent church. "I work cattle up near Bitterroot Pass. I don't know what that man promised you, miss, but it seems to me he didn't earn the right to keep it." He took another step. "What I do know is this," he said, his voice dropping a little, meant only for her. "If you'll have me, I'll marry you. Right here. Right now." The silence that followed was absolute. You could have heard a pin drop on the dusty floor. Josie just blinked once, her face unreadable. This man, Wade Coulter, he wasn't smiling. He wasn't bluffing. He stood there like a mountain, like a man who had made a choice, and the world could break against him before he'd unmake it. He wasn't trying to be a hero. You could see it in his eyes. He saw something wrong, and he was the kind of man who had to step in and make it right. You don't know me, Josie said finally. Her voice was as even and steady as a rolling pin on a flour-dusted table. No, ma'am, Wade said, but I know what it feels like to be left standing in the wrong kind of silence. And I know what it's like to want something better than what the world seems willing to give you. She studied him. His face was creased by the sun and the wind. His jaw was set. There was no trickery in him. It was plain as day. While everyone else in that church was shifting and whispering, he stood perfectly still, waiting for her. Her heart, which she thought had been bruised into silence, gave one single hard thump against her ribs. The preacher looked from Wade to Josie, his mouth hanging open. Miss Whitlock? Josie took a breath, a long, slow one, then another. My name is Josie Whitlock, she said, and her voice was firm now, clear as a bell. And if you're asking honest, then I'll say yes. A storm of whispers erupted in the pews, but Josie didn't look at them. She didn't look at her sister or the shocked face of the preacher. She stepped down from the altar, walked right up to Wade Coulter, and she took his hand. And just like that, they were married. The lilacs in her hair were brittle now, and there was dust on both their boots. The preacher's voice shook as he said the words, and Maddie wiped tears from her cheeks, though no one could say if they were happy or sad. Wade's hand was warm and steady in hers. When he said his vows, his voice was plain and clear, like he was promising to fix a fence or shoe a horse. It was a promise he intended to keep. When it was all done, a strange, stunned applause broke out. It was unsure, but it was honest. Outside, the sun was starting to dip behind the ridge. Wade led her, not to a fine carriage, but to a simple buckboard wagon, hitched to a sturdy horse. He helped her up onto the seat like she weighed nothing at all. As they rolled away from the church, down the same road Harlan was supposed to have ridden in on, Josie looked back just once. The wedding cake was still sitting on the table. The top layer had finally collapsed into the second. They rode for miles without speaking. It wasn't awkward, it was just quiet. The sun bled out of the sky, leaving streaks of violet and orange behind. Josie sat with her hands folded in her lap, the weight of the day pressing down on her. Who was this man beside her? This sudden husband? She'd gambled her entire life on a stranger's word in a dusty church. It was nearly dark when he finally pulled the wagon to a stop. We're here, he said. Home. It wasn't much. A one-room cabin with a small stable out back. There were no flowers, no curtains in the window, just a sturdy-looking shack sitting alone under a vast, starry sky. It was the most isolated place she had ever seen. A chill that had nothing to do with the night air crept down her spine. She was miles from anyone, completely at the mercy of a man she'd met only hours ago. As he helped her down, she caught a glimpse of something in the back of the wagon, half hidden under a canvas tarp. It was a leather satchel, a nice one, the kind a man who worked for the railroad might carry, and glinting in the faint moonlight, she saw the initials embossed on the flap. H.A.D. Harlan Avery Deeks. Her blood ran cold. This man, her new husband, had her fiancé's bag. What did that mean? Did he find it on the road? Did he rob Harlan? Or was it something much, much worse? Suddenly, the remote cabin didn't feel sturdy. It felt like a trap. I'll sleep in the barn, Wade said, his voice pulling her out of her spiraling thoughts. Give you your space. He said it like a gentleman, an act of kindness. But as he gestured toward the cabin door, a horrifying thought struck her. Maybe he wasn't giving her space. Maybe he was giving her a cage. Josie stood frozen on the dusty ground, the weight of her blue cotton wedding dress suddenly feeling like chains. The cabin loomed before her, dark and silent. Her husband, this complete stranger, was telling her he'd sleep in the barn, leaving her the house. On the surface, it was a gesture of respect, a way to give her choice, to give her time. But with Harlan's satchel sitting in the back of that wagon, the gesture felt sinister. Was he trying to earn her trust, or was he just locking his prey away for the night? Thank you, she managed to say, her voice barely a whisper. He gave a short nod, then picked up her small trunk and carried it inside. He set it down gently by the wall, then turned and left, closing the door behind him with a soft click. She heard his heavy boots cross the porch, then fade toward the barn. She was alone. The first thing she did was shove a heavy wooden chair under the doorknob. It wouldn't stop a determined man, but it would make noise. It would give her a warning. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She was a practical woman. She'd faced down winter storms and sick livestock. She wasn't one for hysterics. But this was different. This was an unknown. A man with a shadow in his past so fresh it was still clinging to his boots. The cabin was sparse but clean. A table, 2 chairs, a stove, a narrow bed against the far wall with the linens tucked in tight. Above the small stone fireplace, a rifle was mounted on 2 wooden pegs. She moved toward it immediately. Her father, for all his faults, had taught her how to shoot. She reached up and took the rifle down. It was heavy, solid. She checked it with practiced hands. It was loaded. Clutching the rifle, she began a frantic, quiet search of the small room. She looked under the bed, in the small cupboard, behind the thin curtain that sectioned off a tiny pantry. She found nothing, just the simple belongings of a man who lived alone. Cans of beans, a tin of coffee, a dog-eared cattleman's almanac. She was about to give up, to convince herself she was letting fear get the better of her, when her hand brushed against the straw-stuffed mattress on the bed. She felt something flat and stiff tucked beneath it. Her fingers trembled as she pulled it out. It was a piece of paper, folded and creased from handling. She moved closer to the single lantern she'd lit, holding the paper up to the flickering light. It was a wanted poster. The drawing was rough, but the face was unmistakable. The charming smile, the confident eyes. It was Harlan, except the name printed in big bold letters at the top wasn't Harlan Avery Deeks. It was Henry Archer. And beneath the name, the words, wanted, for fraud, land swindles, and confidence schemes. Her fiancé, the man who was supposed to give her a new life. He was a criminal, a con man. The whole thing, his promises, his fancy talk, it had all been a lie. She felt a wave of sickness, but it was quickly replaced by ice-cold clarity. This changed everything, but it didn't explain Wade. Who was he? A bounty hunter, tracking Harlan for the reward? Or was he something else? A partner in crime, maybe, who'd had a falling out with Harlan over their last score. The satchel in the wagon suddenly made a terrifying kind of sense. It was the money, their money, and Wade had all of it. That meant Harlan or Henry or whoever he was might come looking for it. He might come here. The thought made her skin crawl. She looked at the barricaded door, at the loaded rifle in her hands. She had escaped one trap only to walk straight into another, far more dangerous one. She spent the rest of the night sitting in that hard wooden chair, the rifle across her lap, watching the door and waiting for the sun to rise. When morning finally came, casting pale light through the single window, she had a plan. She unbarricaded the door and stepped outside, blinking in the bright air. Wade was by the corral, brushing down his horse. He turned as she approached, and his face was unreadable. She held up the wanted poster. His eyes flickered to it, then back to her face. He didn't look surprised. "I know who he is," she said, her voice hard. "Now you're going to tell me who you are, and you're going to tell me what happened to him, and what was in that satchel." Wade stopped brushing the horse. He let out a long, slow breath and leaned against the corral fence. He looked tired, older than he had in the church. "His name is Henry Archer," Wade said, his voice low and gravelly. "And he didn't just swindle strangers, he swindled my family." Josie listened, her grip tight on the poster, her other hand never far from the cabin door where the rifle was waiting. "He came through our valley 2 years back," Wade continued, his eyes fixed on some distant point on the horizon. "Called himself a land agent for the railroad. Promised my father a fortune for our spread. Said the tracks were coming right through. My pa, he was a trusting man. He signed it all over for a pile of worthless stock certificates." He paused, swallowing hard. "The money was gone. The land was gone. It broke my father. He was dead within a year. The story was awful, but it still felt incomplete. It felt like a piece was missing." "But that's not the end of it," Wade said, and his voice turned to ice. "My younger brother, Thomas, he was hot-headed. He couldn't let it go. He swore he'd track Archer down and get our money back. He followed him for months." Wade finally turned to look at her, and the look in his eyes made the hair on her arms stand up. It was pure, raw grief, mixed with something else, something dark and burning. Henry Archer killed my brother, he said. Left him in a ditch outside of Wichita. I buried him myself. The pieces slammed into place in Josie's mind, forming a picture that was both terrifying and tragic. Wade wasn't a bounty hunter. He wasn't a partner in crime. He was a man seeking revenge. I've been tracking Archer for almost a year, Wade admitted, his voice rough with emotion. I followed him here, to Corvallis. I knew about you. I knew he was planning to marry you, and I figured he was after your family's land next. I was waiting for him on the road into town yesterday. I was going to make him pay for what he did to Thomas. Josie's mind raced. So what happened? Where is he? We fought, Wade said, clenching his fists. He's a coward. As soon as I got the upper hand, he ran, dropped his satchel and took off into the hills like a spooked coyote. I went after him, but I lost his trail. When I came back, I knew he'd either be long gone or hiding somewhere, waiting. I came to the church to warn you, to tell you what kind of man he was. He looked at her, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. But then I saw you, he said, standing there at that altar, so proud, so steady, refusing to crumble. And I don't know, a different thought came into my head. I figured if you were my wife, if you had my name, my protection, he couldn't come back for you. He couldn't touch you. It was the only thing I could think of to keep you safe. He was telling the truth. She could feel it. The story was too raw, too painful to be a lie. He had married her to protect her, but that protection came at a cost. She was now married to a man consumed by a quest for vengeance, a man who had already had one violent confrontation with a dangerous criminal, and that criminal, Harlan or Henry or whatever his name was still out there. He was alive. He had lost his money, and he knew exactly where to find it. He knew Wade had it, and now he knew Wade had a wife. Josie looked from Wade's haunted face to the isolated cabin, to the vast empty wilderness that surrounded them. She wasn't just a pawn in his game. She was the bait in his trap. The next few days passed in a tense, watchful silence. Josie and Wade moved around each other like two stray dogs, wary and uncertain. They were husband and wife on paper, but in reality they were allies in a battle they hadn't chosen. He spent his days riding the property lines, his rifle always slung over his shoulder. She spent her days turning the cabin into a home, but her eyes were always on the horizon, watching for a lone rider. She learned to read the different kinds of quiet. There was the peaceful quiet of early morning, and then there was the listening quiet of dusk, when every snap of a twig sounded like a footstep. One afternoon, while cleaning out the small loft in the barn where Wade had been sleeping, her hand brushed against a loose floorboard. Curiosity got the better of her. She pried it up. Underneath, wrapped in oilcloth, was a small stack of letters. They were from his brother, Thomas. She knew she shouldn't read them, but she couldn't stop herself. They were full of life, of jokes and plans for the future. The last letter was different. It was dated just days before his death. Wade, it read, I think I've got him cornered. Archer's holed up in Wichita. He's not as smart as he thinks. I'm going to get our money back. Don't worry about me. I won't do anything foolish. This isn't about a fight. It's about justice. The words sent a shiver down her spine. It's about justice. That's not what Wade had said. Wade had made it sound like a simple ambush. But this letter, it sounded like his brother was walking into a trap. Did Wade know? Had he left that part out? The line between justice and revenge, she was learning, was a thin and blurry one. That evening, as they ate a silent supper of beans and cornbread, she saw him looking at her. You're not scared, he said. It wasn't a question. I've been scared before, she replied, not meeting his eyes. It doesn't get the chores done. A small, sad smile touched his lips. Thomas used to say something like that. Before she could decide whether to tell him about the letters, they were interrupted by the sound of an approaching horse. Both of them were on their feet in an instant. Wade grabbed the rifle from the mantel, his movements fluid and practiced. He moved to the window, peering out into the twilight. Josie's heart hammered in her chest. Was it him? Had Harlan finally come back? "Who is it?" she whispered. Wade was silent for a long moment. Then he lowered the rifle slightly. "It's the sheriff." Relief washed over her, but it was quickly replaced by a new kind of dread. The sheriff wouldn't be riding all the way out here for a social call. Sheriff Brody was a big man with a weary face. He took off his hat as he stepped inside, his eyes taking in the scene. The two of them standing too far apart, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. "Colder, ma'am," he said, nodding to Josie. "Sorry to bother you so late." "What can we do for you, Sheriff?" Wade asked, his voice carefully neutral. The sheriff shifted his weight, his gaze landing on Wade. "Just got word from the marshal in Helena. Some riders found a body up in the East Pass. Looks like he's been out there for a few days." Josie felt the air leave her lungs. "Man's name was Harlan Deeks," the sheriff continued, watching Wade's face closely. "Or so his papers said. A railroad man. Supposed to be getting married in town last week." He let the words hang in the air. "Funny thing is," Sheriff Brody said, his voice dropping, "the day he went missing, that's the same day you two got hitched. Strange coincidence, wouldn't you say?" Wade didn't flinch. "We wouldn't know anything about that, Sheriff." The sheriff's eyes moved to Josie. It was a test. She knew it. Her mind raced. Wade had told her Harlan ran off, that he'd lost him in the hills. Was that a lie? Did Wade find him again? Did he finish the fight he started? The sheriff thought so. He was here because he suspected Wade of murder. She had a choice. A terrible, stark choice. She could tell the sheriff everything she knew. About the wanted poster. About Wade tracking Harlan for revenge. She could save herself. Or she could protect this stranger. Her husband. The man who had lied to her about his brother. And who might be a killer. What was the right thing to do? She looked at Wade, standing tall and steady, the rifle still held loosely in his hand. She thought of him walking into that church, offering her his name when she had nothing. She thought of the grief in his eyes when he spoke of his brother. She made her choice. "We haven't seen anyone, Sheriff," Josie said, her voice clear and firm, shocking even herself. "We've been here. Alone." The lie fell into the silence of the room, heavy and unbreakable. The sheriff looked from her face to Wade's, his expression unreadable. He knew she was lying. He had to know. But he just nodded slowly. "All right then," he said, putting his hat back on. "You see anything unusual, you let me know." He left. As the sound of his horse faded into the night, Josie and Wade were left alone in the cabin, the lie hanging between them like a shroud. She hadn't just married him. She hadn't just trusted him. Now she was his accomplice. There was no going back. The weeks that followed were thick with unspoken words. Wade never mentioned the sheriff's visit, and Josie never mentioned the lie she told. They were bound together now, not by vows, but by a shared, dangerous secret. She saw the way he watched the horizon, the way he never sat with his back to a window. He was a man waiting for the other shoe to drop. And Josie found herself waiting too. She was learning to live with the fear, to push it down, and let the rhythm of the ranch take over. She started a garden. She organized Wade's haphazard account books into a neat ledger. She was building a life, even if it was a life built on a foundation of secrets. She found that she didn't just respect Wade's strength. She was beginning to understand the pain that fueled it. She'd see him staring at the hills where he'd buried his brother, and her heart would ache for him. He was a good man, she thought. A man who had been pushed too far by a world that had taken everything from him. But was he a killer? The question haunted her dreams. Then one blistering afternoon in late July, another rider appeared on the horizon. This time it wasn't the law. It was a man slumped low in the saddle, his clothes tattered, his face hidden by a dusty hat. As he got closer, a feeling of cold, familiar dread washed over Josie. She knew that slouch. It was her father. Roy Whitlock. Wade came out of the barn, wiping grease from his hands with a rag, his body instantly tense. He stood beside Josie on the porch, a silent, solid presence. Her father didn't dismount right away. He just sat on his horse looking at them. He looked older, more broken than she'd ever seen him. "Josie, girl," he said, his voice a hoarse croak. "Heard you got married." "Hello, Roy," she said, her voice flat. There were no pleasantries between them. There hadn't been for years. I came to make my peace, he said, finally swinging a leg over the saddle. He stumbled as he landed, and the smell of cheap whiskey wafted over to them. You came for money, she corrected him. He sighed, a rattling sound in his chest. I'm in trouble, Josie. Bad trouble. He looked past her, at Wade, his bloodshot eyes full of fear. It's about your fella, the one who didn't show. Josie and Wade exchanged a look. What about him? Wade asked, his voice low and dangerous. Roy flinched. We had a deal, he stammered, wringing his hat in his hands. He was going to clear my debts. All my gambling debts. All I had to do. He couldn't meet Josie's eyes. All I had to do was get you to marry him, and then convince you to sign over the deed to your mother's old place. The confession hit Josie like a physical blow. Her own father. He had been part of the con. He had been willing to sell her, to sell their home, to a criminal to save his own skin. I couldn't do it, Roy whispered, tears running down his grimy cheeks. At the last minute, I couldn't do it. I rode out to meet him on the wedding day, to tell him the deal was off, that he could leave you be. He looked up, his eyes wide with a frantic terror. But someone else was already there. I saw it. I saw him, he said, pointing a shaking finger at Wade. I saw you two fighting on the road. I hid in the trees. I saw him run off. And I saw you take his satchel. Wade's jaw was tight as stone. Get to the point, old man. After you left, Roy choked out, after you rode off toward the church, I thought it was over. But then, someone else came out of the woods. Josie's blood went cold. A third person? Who? She breathed. Who did you see? Roy was shaking now, looking around as if the devil himself might be listening from the trees. It was a woman, he whispered, his voice cracking. A woman from the church. The one who's always whispering. Miss Ada Bell. He looked from Josie to Wade, his eyes pleading. She had a little pistol in her hand, a Derringer. She walked right up to where Harlan was hiding in the gully. And I heard it. I heard the shot. Miss Ada Bell, the quiet, gossiping woman from the pews, the one who had warned against trusting a railman. It didn't make any sense. Why would she be involved? Josie looked at Wade. His face was a mask of disbelief, the same disbelief she felt. Her father was a liar and a drunk, but the terror in his eyes, that was real. He had seen something that had shaken him to his core. She killed him? Josie stammered. I don't know, Roy cried. I just heard the shot and I ran. I've been running ever since. But they're looking for me now. The men Harlan owed money to. They think I know where his satchel is. Suddenly it all clicked into place. The sheriff finding Harlan's body, the whispers in town, and Miss Ada Bell, always watching, always listening. Had her quiet judgment been a cover for something far more sinister? Wade, Josie said, her voice urgent. When you fought Harlan, was he hurt? Wade shook his head, his mind clearly racing. No, I bloodied his nose, but he was fine. He ran. He was alive when I left him. He was telling the truth. Josie knew, with a sudden, gut-wrenching certainty, that Wade was not a killer. He had sought a fight. He had sought his own kind of justice, but he hadn't taken a life. Someone else had, and that someone was a little old woman who sat in the second pew every Sunday. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The story they had been living, the story of a jilted bride and a vengeful stranger, was wrong. They were just minor characters in a much older, darker tale. We have to go into town, Josie said, her voice steady now, filled with a new resolve. We have to talk to her. Wade just nodded, his eyes grim. The threat they had been hiding from wasn't a ghost from the past. It was a pillar of the community. And she had let Wade take the blame, let the whole town suspect him, while she hid behind her gloved hands and whispered judgments. This wasn't just about Harlan anymore. This was about the truth, and they were the only two people who could uncover it. The ride into Corvallis was silent and fast. The setting sun cast long, distorted shadows across the trail, making the familiar landscape feel alien and threatening. Josie and Wade rode side by side, a silent team bound by a mission they hadn't asked for. Roy, her father, had been left at the cabin, too terrified to go anywhere, a pathetic ghost from a life Josie was rapidly leaving behind. They found Miss Ada Bell on the porch of her small, neat-as-a-pin house, watering her geraniums as if it were any other evening. She looked up as they approached, a small, knowing smile on her face. There was no surprise in her eyes. It was as if she'd been expecting them. "Mr. Calder." "Mrs. Calder," she said, her voice as crisp as a starched collar. "I had a feeling I might be seeing you." "We need to talk about Harlan Deeks," Wade said, his voice flat and hard. He stayed by the horses, his hand resting near the pistol on his hip. Josie stepped forward. "My father told us what he saw." Ada Bell set down her watering can with a quiet sigh. She gestured to the two rocking chairs on her porch. "You might as well sit. This is a long story." They didn't sit. They stood before her like judges. "Henry Archer, you mean?" Ada said, her voice losing its gossipy edge and taking on the hardness of old iron. "Harlan Deeks was just one of his many names." She looked at Wade. "He came through my town 15 years ago. My husband Arthur was a good man, a trusting man, much like your father, I imagine. Archer sold him on a silver mine, took every penny we had, our farm, our savings, everything." Her eyes grew distant, lost in a painful memory. "Arthur couldn't live with the shame. He took his own life that winter, left me with nothing but his debts and a name nobody would trust." She paused, her gaze turning as sharp as a needle. "I spent the next 15 years tracking him. I learned his methods. He'd find a good family, a trusting family, usually one with a daughter of marrying age. He'd charm his way in, and then he'd bleed them dry and disappear." She looked directly at Josie, and for the first time, Josie saw not a meddling old woman, but a warrior. "When he came to Corvallis, I knew him instantly," Ada said. "I watched him with you. I saw the same lies, the same empty promises. I knew I couldn't let it happen again. I couldn't let him destroy another family." "So you killed him," Wade said, the accusation hanging heavy in the evening air. Ada Bell's smile was thin and cold. "Mr. Coulter, you wanted a fight. You wanted revenge for your brother. I admire that. But a fight isn't enough for a man like Archer. He'd just run away and do it all again." "I didn't want revenge." She stood up, her small frame radiating an immense, unshakable certainty. "I wanted justice," she said. "I followed you that day. I watched you fight him. And when he ran, I knew you'd let him go. So I did what had to be done. I put an end to his story." A chilling realization washed over Josie. "The wedding," she whispered. "When you were whispering in the church. What did you say?" Ada almost looked proud. "Oh, I was just telling folks what a shame it was, that poor girl being left at the altar. And wasn't it a lucky thing that a strong, handsome stranger like Mr. Coulter happened to be in town? A man like that," I said, "ought to step in and do the right thing." She had orchestrated it, all of it. She had goaded Wade, nudged him into the church, knowing it would give him a connection to the event, a place in the story. She had used him to create a distraction, to muddy the waters and point the sheriff's suspicion squarely in his direction, all while she committed the perfect, final act of her long quest. Just then, they heard the sound of boots on the gravel road. It was Sheriff Brody walking toward them, his face grim. He must have seen them ride into town. Ada Bell didn't even flinch. She smoothed the front of her apron and turned to face him. "Evening, Sheriff," she said calmly. "I believe you've been looking for the person responsible for the death of Mr. Archer." She held out her small, frail hands. "It was me." The truth was finally out, shattering the quiet Montana evening. Wade was innocent. Josie was free. But the resolution felt heavy, complicated. They had walked through fire and come out the other side, but the smoke still clung to them. As Sheriff Brody led a strangely serene Ada Bell away, the townspeople began to emerge from their homes, drawn by the commotion. They stared at Josie and Wade, their faces a mixture of confusion, pity, and dawning respect. They weren't the town scandal anymore. They were survivors. The ride back to the cabin was different. The silence was no longer tense. It was peaceful. The shadows were no longer threatening. They were just shadows. When they reached the small homestead, it looked different too. It looked like home. They stood on the porch for a long time, watching the stars begin to prick the deep violet sky. The chaos was over. The secrets were gone. Now there was just the two of them. "Wade," Josie said softly. He turned to her. In the dim light, she could see the exhaustion in his face, but also a profound relief. The ghost of vengeance that had driven him for so long was finally gone. "I know we started strange," she began, echoing his words from that first tense night. "But if there ever comes a day you look at me and see something more, I think that day is here." He didn't speak. He just stepped closer and gently took her face in his rough, calloused hands. And when he kissed her, it wasn't a kiss of desperation or convenience. It was a kiss that felt earned. A kiss that tasted of second chances and quiet strength. The seasons turned. They signed a new deed at the town clerk's office, their names side by side, Wade Coulter and Josie Whitlock Coulter. They weren't just partners in survival anymore. They were partners in life. He brought her a small carved box one evening, and inside was a simple brass brooch with her initials etched into it. "No one's ever given me something just because," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You gave me a reason to stop chasing ghosts," he answered. "That's not nothing." The following spring, he came home with a burlap-wrapped bundle. It was a peach sapling. Together, they planted it behind the cabin, in a spot where it would catch the morning sun. A symbol of a future they never expected to have. A year to the day after that strange, dusty wedding, Josie stood by that little tree, which now had a few hopeful green leaves. She rested a hand on the gentle swell of her belly. Wade came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her, his hand covering hers. They stood there for a long time, watching the sun set over the hills, the world quiet and peaceful around them. They had built a life not on a pretty promise, but on something far stronger, a shared truth, forged in secrets and sealed with trust. It was a strange beginning for sure, but sometimes the most beautiful things grow from the most unlikely ground. So what do you think? What Miss Annabelle did, was that cold-blooded murder, or was it the only true justice Henry Archer was ever going to face? Let me know your verdict down in the comments, and if you enjoyed this story and want more that will keep you guessing right up to the very end, do me a favor and hit that like button and make sure you subscribe. You won't want to miss the story we have coming next.